British Leyland had a plan. They needed a simple, dependable, easy-to-service family car that would win back fleet buyers and everyday drivers. So on April 27, 1971, they launched the Morris Marina and told the world this was their big comeback. Motorsport magazine was not impressed. Writing in May 1971, the magazine pointed out that British Leyland had built a reputation for clever, innovative engineering. The Marina felt like they had decided to forget all of that and go backwards on purpose. The project was known internally as ADO-28, and the company poured serious money into production changes and a new gearbox factory to handle the volume they expected. Almost immediately, a real problem surfaced. The Marina pushed too wide in corners, what engineers call understeer, and some writers used a stronger word, dangerous. By December 1971, Motorsport was reporting that the front suspension had already been altered, and that earlier cars had been called back for modifications. That is a rough start for a car meant to restore public confidence in British Leyland. After the fix, things did improve. One reporter who covered over 1,400 miles found the Marina economical and dependable. The only thing that fell off during the entire trip was a small cabin latch piece. Not a glowing review, but not a disaster either. The Marina was never built for fast, twisty roads. It was built for school runs, commutes, and trips to the supermarket. Real people used it exactly that way. A couple in Essex bought a 1971 Marina 1.3 in 1973 and drove it as their everyday car for more than 40 years, covering around 130,000 miles before donating it to the British Motor Museum in 2019. By 1973, the Marina had climbed to second place in the United Kingdom sales charts. Over the full production run from 1971 to 1980, 1,135,343 were built. But rust was always lurking. A classic and sports car buyer's guide puts it plainly. Rust is the biggest enemy, hiding in safety-critical areas where owners never think to look. One owner who inherited a well-kept example recalled how people laughed at the idea of preserving a Marina in the early 1990s. The laughter stopped at the owner's show years later. The Marina was not a great car, but it was a real one, and over 1 million families chose it anyway. If the Morris Marina was British Leyland's awkward first step after the merger, the Austin Maestro was supposed to be proof that the company had finally grown up. When it launched in March 1983, Motorsport called it crucial, not just as a new product, but as evidence that British Leyland could execute a modern idea without repeating earlier mistakes. The magazine was honest about the stakes. The company had already earned a reputation for poor execution, and the Maestro had to break that pattern. On paper, it had strong credentials: front-wheel drive, a 5-door hatchback layout, a practical cabin, safe cornering, and technology that genuinely felt advanced in the early 1980s. That technology included electronic engine management, advanced headlights, and, on some trim levels, a voice synthesis unit. This gadget spoke warnings to the driver through the radio speaker. Seatbelt not fastened, oil pressure low, handbrake still on. Motorsport's writer called it tedious, though it could be switched off. Many drivers probably switched it off before leaving the driveway. A follow-up road impressions piece from Motorsport found the Maestro comfortable, roomy, and good value. But the test car developed minor rattles and thumps from the dashboard and door area during normal driving. The final verdict was competent, but without much character. That is the kind of review that sells cars to practical buyers and bores everyone else. The longer-term story was harder. A Classics World Buyer's Guide confirms what owners eventually discovered. Quality and reliability proved to be a real issue. Rust attacked door bottoms, arches, sills, and seams. The bonded windscreen could leak and trigger corrosion in hidden areas. Replacement panels were difficult to source. The clever electronics that impressed buyers in 1983 became headaches once they aged or were poorly repaired. In total, 605,411 Maestros were built between 1982 and 1994. Today, they are genuinely rare on British roads. A classic and sports car feature profiled an owner named Barry Cooper, whose luxury trim Maestro was one of only 9 left registered on United Kingdom roads. His example, interestingly, did not have the talking dashboard that earlier versions were known for. A car remembered mostly for an annoying gadget, and yet today, surviving examples are treated like genuine treasures. The Triumph Stag arrived in June 1970, promising something genuinely different. A stylish 2-door open car built around a 3.0-liter V8 designed to feel sophisticated rather than raw. It was Standard Triumph's first V8-powered production car, and the idea was to give buyers a practical, classy open tourer they could actually use every day. The engineering approach was sensible rather than revolutionary. The transmission, suspension, and steering were largely carried over from existing Triumph units. The body was reinforced for rigidity, and a detachable hardtop was offered from the start, a practical touch that gave buyers flexibility across seasons. The press reception, however, got off to a spectacularly bad start. Motorsport ran a road test titled "The Stag at Last," and the opening explained exactly why it had taken so long. The test car arrived late because of a lock fault. Either the ignition worked, but the steering locked, or the steering was free, but the engine would not start. The writer eventually left London at 10:30 at night with the car finally sorted, driving unfamiliar roads in the dark. The test itself found things to like: comfort, equipment, and that smooth V8. But complaints arrived quickly. The gear change was notchy. A rattle traced to the passenger seat annoyed the writer throughout, and the power steering gave no feeling whatsoever of what the front wheels were doing, which led to overcorrection and messy cornering when driven hard. Then there is the bigger story about cooling. A classic and sports car buyer's guide is direct. A properly rebuilt and serviced Stag engine can be a genuine pleasure. But many engines were not properly maintained. Overheating, leaks, and neglected timing chain service destroyed a large number of them. Rust added to the problem, with any poorly treated example rotting badly regardless of age. Total production across the 1970 to 1977 run was 25,939 cars. Motorsport even printed a telegram sent to Donald Stokes, the man running British Leyland at the time, complaining that the magazine had not yet published a road test, suggesting buyers were waiting for the verdict before ordering. That kind of emotional investment in a car is remarkable. It shows just how much hope people had placed in the Stag, long before reality started catching up. The MGC is the oldest car in this group, and its story is one of the cleanest examples of how a first impression can harden into permanent mythology. It debuted at the 1967 Earl's Court Motor Show as MG's most powerful sports car to date. Under the bonnet sat a new 2,912 cubic centimeter straight-six engine, and the goal was grand tourer duties, a grown-up MG for longer journeys at higher speeds. Production numbers tell you this was always a small experiment. The MG Owners Club records 4,542 Roadsters and 4,457 GT versions built between 1967 and 1969, totaling 8,999 cars. That made the MGC rare from the moment the first one left the factory. The contemporary press was not kind. A Goodwood Classic Solutions guide describes the reaction bluntly. The MGC was hated by the motoring press. The iron block 6-cylinder engine sat heavily over the front axle, making the steering feel laborious and the car push wide in corners. Hemmings backs the same picture, noting that road testers panned the MGC for understeer and a heavy feel, even though the smooth engine could push the car to around 120 miles per hour, 193 kilometers per hour. The commercial result followed the reviews. The car struggled in the marketplace, and the last one was built in September 1969. If you have not subscribed to the channel yet, this is a good moment to do it. We go this deep on every car, and there are still 2 more of these disasters to get through. There is one detail that makes the press story even more frustrating. According to the Goodwood Guide, the first press cars were reportedly delivered with underinflated tires. That made the car feel more nose-heavy and understeery than it actually was in normal use, helping lock in a negative reputation that followed the MGC for decades. Whether that happened by accident or by oversight, it may have cost the car its chance at a fair hearing from the start. Time, though, was kinder than the journalists. Later owners discovered what the initial reviews had missed. The MGC was a mature, comfortable, long-distance cruiser. The Goodwood Guide reports that King Charles kept an MGC GT for 3 decades before eventually passing it on to Prince William as a birthday gift. When royalty holds onto a car for 30 years, the original press verdict starts to look a little hasty. The Leyland Princess arrived on March 26, 1975, although it did not start life with that name. British Leyland launched it as the 1822 series before rationalizing the badge mix into the single Princess name that most people remember today. An Autocar opinion piece marks the birthday precisely and makes an important point. The Princess is often treated as a punchline, but it deserves a more honest look. That look starts with the design and the engineering ambition behind it. Harris Mann styled the exterior, and the wedge shape was genuinely striking for 1975. The engineering goals were serious: improved boot space, a modern driving position, reduced cabin noise, very strong body stiffness, and hydroga suspension tuned using lessons from earlier British Leyland development work. The project even used early computer-aided design techniques for body engineering, not as a novelty, but as a practical way to make panels fit accurately and keep production flowing efficiently. In 1977, Autocar rated the 6-cylinder 2200 HLS variant as the best car it had tested that year. The reasons were listed plainly: cabin space, ride comfort, interior fittings, road holding, and refinement. These are not glamorous qualities, but they are exactly the ones that matter in everyday family use. The Princess was genuinely delivering where it counted most. Then came the problems. Autocar described the marketing slogan, "The car that's got it all together," as asking for trouble, and trouble arrived in quantity. Rear suspension mountings failed. Drive shaft problems were severe enough to require a minor physical relocation of the 6-cylinder engine within the engine bay. Strike action disrupted the factory repeatedly, and quality control suffered badly during a period when British Leyland was under enormous financial and industrial pressure. Total production reached 224,942 cars, including the early 1822 series vehicles, and production ended in November 1981. A Classics World Buyer's Guide frames today's ownership reality clearly. Rust is the dominant threat, attacking door bottoms, sills, floors, and seams, with replacement panels now scarce and expensive. The Princess had the ingredients of a genuinely good car. The concept was sound, the ride quality was praised, and the design was bold. What it could not do was survive the gap between what it promised and what the troubled production line actually delivered. Autocar acknowledged it was actually rather good in concept. Being good in concept and being good in practice are two very different things. The Triumph TR7 looked like the future. The sharp wedge body, the black rubber bumpers, the pop-up headlamps. It was a bold design statement for the mid-1970s. But looks can only carry a car so far, and the TR7's early years were defined more by what went wrong inside the factory than by what happened out on the road. Early TR7s were plagued by build quality issues, and combined with British Leyland's wider industrial troubles, the model never really stood a chance in its first years. The car launched in 1974 and 1975 and was initially built at the Speak plant in Liverpool, which was dealing with serious and sustained strike disruption. Moving production to Canley and Coventry in 1978, then to Solihull in 1980, brought real improvements in build quality. Early and late TR7s could feel like completely different cars as a result. The problems that shaped the early reputation were practical and expensive. Rust attacked the nose, sills, and suspension mounting points. The pop-up headlamp mechanism caused wiring faults. The water pump could leak. Cooling system neglect led to overheating and head gasket damage, a familiar pattern in British Leyland products of this era. A classic and sports car fact file lists 112,368 hardtop coupes built. A New Zealand classic car report adds that 28,864 roadsters were produced, with the convertible version arriving in 1979. The Roadster is widely considered the more enjoyable car to own, and it also arrived during the better production period. Total production ended in October 1981. The human story that best captures what the TR7 could actually be comes from the same New Zealand classic car article. A longtime autocar journalist named Stuart Bladen bought a TR7 convertible, partly because the insurance cost on a newer convertible was too high. He later took a writer out for a top-down drive, and the result genuinely surprised that passenger. Civilized ride, decent handling, low noise levels. A journalist who arrived expecting to be disappointed left quietly impressed. The TR7 was not the TR6 it replaced, and it never tried to be. It was softer, more road-oriented, and more practical as daily transport. When the factories finally got the build quality right, the car showed what it was always capable of. It just took far too long to get there. And by the time it did, the damage to the TR7's reputation was already permanent.